'Cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Mike D coming down for sure.
Now that we've had a look at regulation and accountability, we also need to have a deeper think about regulation and the positives and the negatives. So we've got some broad approaches to regulation theory for us to think about in terms of why we might want to regulate activities and why we might not. So let's hop into these theories of regulation. Rather than thinking about regulation as all good or all bad, perhaps a better way of thinking about it is how much regulation is the right amount. So to understand that, I think we need to look at some different theories of regulation. We have both public interest theories of regulation and private interest theories of regulation. So public interest theories are based on the view that those regulating need to promote the general welfare of the community. So we need to understand how the regulation is going to make the community better. Private interest theories actually say that regulation might actually be negative in terms of private interests capturing the regulators. Public interest theories stress market failure and the ability of regulation to correct market failures, whereas private interest theories stress the failure of regulation itself. So let's have a look at these theories in a little more. First off, we've got welfare economics. So welfare economics recognises that markets aren't perfect. We have imperfect markets, which an economist would often call market failure. When we have market failure, we may need to regulate it to get a better social outcome. So when might we get market failure? Well, there are some kinds of businesses where you can be dominated by one or a few suppliers. Traditionally, these were large economies of scale, so power, water, anything that has a large distributive infrastructure tended to have a large economy of scale and be better as a regulated industry. And that's why traditionally energy and the water supply, along with national interest, but the economics of these businesses meant that they're better off with heavy government involvement, either ownership or regulation. We get a similar kind of argument with some markets that have been around more recently than these large infrastructure ones, particularly in technology where we have network effects. So traditional economics works on the idea that the more people have something, the less it's worth. So something is worth more when it's scarce. But some things, like a telephone or Instagram, actually become more valuable as more people have it. So it actually works the reverse of traditional economics. Why? Well, if only one person has a telephone, they can't phone anyone. There's no use. If 2 people have a telephone, you can call one other person. 3 people, 4 people, 5, the more people have telephones, the more people you can contact, the more valuable it becomes. Okay. So again, these operate like monopolies, in that we tend to get big overall winners. And we see a lot of arguments in society today about regulation of big tech, right? For this exact reason. Okay, so we have economies of scale. We have things like a network effect. What else is there? Well, there are some goods or services that it's hard to actually price everything in. And economists would call these things externalities. Okay? So externalities can be negative externalities or they can be positive externalities. So let's think about what this means. Pollution has traditionally been seen as a negative externality. And in fact, most of the argument about climate change and greenhouse gas emission is the fact that the people producing it aren't paying for it. It's a negative externality. And if we have negative externalities, then we need to regulate those areas in some form. A positive externality is where someone benefits from the activity of another, but they're not actually paying for it. So a great example of that, for instance, is street lighting. Okay, so if I put a light out the front of my house to benefit me as I come home, it also benefits those people walking past my house who can see it and they don't pay anything for it. So when we have these negative effects or positive effects that aren't captured in the transaction, we may need to regulate to make sure we take care of these externalities. If we don't, then we can get situations where people won't pay for something and something of benefit to society won't be provided. And I'll leave you to look at the example of something like national defence, where our Defence Force can't decide which houses it's actually going to defend and which ones it isn't. It has to defend the broad area. So if it was a user pay system, many people would choose not to pay but would have to be defended anyway. And this is the idea that we do need some, even the most classical economists and libertarians would suggest we do need government for some areas of life because of these effects. We do need some regulation. Now, a different approach that's similar but different is the political approach, which suggests that there are some reasons, such as social justice or a social outcome, will justify regulation. So it's not making an economic argument like the welfare economics argument we've just heard. What it's trying to say is that it's good for society because of the values in society, irrespective of the economics. So income tax and social security laws would be examples. We're redistributing wealth. Anti-discrimination, right? We don't really care about the economic outcomes. We just say that's the right thing to do. The same thing for some areas such as environmental degradation. So these are things where society says we want to protect this area or get a social outcome. Then the political approach suggests we need to regulate those areas because it won't occur naturally. Now, in contrast to these public theories of regulation, there are private theories of regulation. These private theories suggest that, while regulation might seem like a good idea, it doesn't always work out that way, and they have two core instances. The first instance is regulatory failure. So what occurs in regulatory failure? Quite simply, the costs of the regulation are more than the benefits of the regulation. And that's an important consideration when you consider that we have to create a whole accountability mechanism, we have to change everyone's behaviour, etc. So you'd want to see some real benefits coming from the particular regulation that you put in place. If those benefits don't outweigh the costs of the regulation, then you've really got to question whether it was worth it. For me personally, I think a classic example of this is the recent move in Queensland to take bottles to the recycle centre. Given we already have recycling of these bottles, there's a pretty big cost in order to get people to take the bottles themselves in their cars, sort them themselves, put them into this separate sorting mechanism outside of their traditional approach, plus pay an extra 10 cents, plus have a mechanism to pay them back 10 cents and all that infrastructure. For what benefit? I don't know, considering they were already supposedly being collected for recycling. I think understanding that cost benefit would be a very useful activity. So that to me is an example of regulation where you could argue we would really want to see that the costs of the new system don't outweigh the benefits of that new system. The second area where you get a problem with regulation is what's called regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a little bit different in that what it says is if you have enough people who don't really get affected that badly by a regulation, they won't put up a fight against a small group who benefits a lot. So think about this. Imagine you're an egg producer. And you could somehow get the government to implement a new law. And all it did was increase the profit on your eggs by 1 cent an egg. Now, to the average consumer, 1 cent an egg, 12 cents a dozen, they're probably not going to notice it. But to you, as an egg producer, that could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars a year, right? So overall, society's worse off because you have, virtually everyone in Australia paying extra for eggs. But because there's no real way for that minority to recognise or amalgamate that little bit of negative in order to influence regulation, what we're going to get is those people who make a lot out of the regulation, they'll be able to introduce the regulator. Okay, so that's what you hear when you hear people discussing the role of lobbyists and whether lobbyists have too much influence. What they're really saying, if they're being negative about lobbyists, is that we may suffer from regulatory capture. We have these special interest groups. The traditional one that people talk about, say, mining companies have regulatory capture over the politicians to make regulations around a new mine, etc. Similarly, from a different perspective, you could argue that, say, an environmental group which represents a minority of the population could capture the regulators through political pressure and agitate against it. So it's not about whether it's a mining company or an environmental group. It's this idea of a small minority having more at stake and being able to capture the regulatory mechanism. So there you have it. Whether you should regulate or not is not a clear-cut decision. It's very similar to the idea of ethics. We've got to look at the reasons we would want to regulate and make sure we can achieve those outcomes without falling prey to the negatives. So we want to think about, is there an economic reason, like the welfare economics approach, or a political approach driving our need for regulation? Then we need to think about whether that benefit that we're looking for will outweigh the cost of the regulation, that we don't have regulatory failure. And we also need to think about whether the regulatory process might actually be captured by one or two actors in order to warp that regulatory process, where we'd have regulatory capture. And those four factors are all at play whenever we're talking about specifically legal regulation and making laws.